The helicopter blades cut through the Afghan desert air with a rhythmic thump that had become as familiar as breathing to the Navy SEALs aboard. Lieutenant Commander Jake Morrison adjusted his headset and glanced at his team, each man lost in his own pre-mission thoughts. They were heading to a hot zone outside Kandahar, where intelligence suggested a high-value target was hiding in a compound surrounded by hostile forces. Morrison had led dozens of missions like this one, but something felt different today. Maybe it was the way the intelligence briefing had been rushed, or perhaps it was the unusual radio chatter they'd been picking up all morning. Whatever it was, his instincts were telling him to stay sharp. The SEAL team consisted of 8 elite operators, each hand-picked for their specialized skills. There was Rodriguez, the demolitions expert who could make anything explode with surgical precision. Thompson handled communications and could hack into enemy systems faster than most people could type. Williams was their sniper, capable of hitting targets at distances that seemed impossible. Each man was a weapon in his own right, trained to perfection and battle-tested in some of the world's most dangerous places. As the helicopter began its descent, Morrison's radio crackled to life. The pilot's voice was tense as he reported enemy movement on the ground. Muzzle flashes lit up the darkness below like deadly fireflies, and the distinctive whistle of incoming rockets filled the air. The mission had gone sideways before they'd even touched down. The helicopter shuddered as it took fire from multiple positions. Morrison felt the aircraft lurch violently to one side, and he knew they were in serious trouble. The pilot was fighting to maintain control, but it was clear they weren't going to make it to the planned landing zone. Through the chaos, Morrison heard the co-pilot shouting coordinates into his radio, calling for immediate medical evacuation support. That's when he first heard her voice on the radio frequency. It was calm, professional, and completely unshaken by the chaos erupting around them. The voice belonged to someone identifying herself as Doc Martinez, a Navy combat medic attached to a nearby forward operating base. She was requesting permission to launch immediately to their location. Despite the heavy enemy fire that had already brought down one aircraft, Morrison found himself wondering what kind of medic would volunteer to fly into a hot landing zone where a SEAL team was taking heavy fire. Most support personnel, while brave and dedicated, weren't eager to put themselves directly in harm's way. But something in Martinez's voice suggested this wasn't her first rodeo. There was a confidence there that only came from experience, the kind of experience that was usually reserved for frontline combat troops. The helicopter finally touched down hard in a cloud of dust and debris. Morrison and his team quickly moved to secure a perimeter, while the crew chief worked frantically to assess the damage to their aircraft. It was immediately clear they weren't flying out on this bird. The engine was smoking, hydraulic fluid was leaking everywhere, and several critical systems had been damaged by enemy fire. Rodriguez set up his machine gun position behind a low stone wall, while Thompson tried to establish communication with headquarters. Williams found an elevated position and began scanning for enemy muzzle flashes through his scope. The rest of the team spread out to create overlapping fields of fire, preparing for what looked like it was going to be a long night. That's when the second helicopter appeared on the horizon, flying low and fast toward their position. Morrison watched through his night vision as the aircraft approached, noting how the pilot was using terrain features to mask his approach and minimize exposure to enemy fire. This wasn't some rookie crew responding to a distress call. These people knew what they were doing. The helicopter touched down just long enough for a single figure to jump out, carrying what appeared to be a massive medical kit. As the aircraft lifted off again, Morrison got his first look at Doc Martinez. She was smaller than he'd expected, probably no more than 5 feet 6 inches tall, but she moved with the confidence and purpose of someone who belonged on a battlefield. Martinez quickly made her way to Morrison's position, keeping low to avoid enemy fire. When she reached him, she immediately began assessing the tactical situation, asking pointed questions about enemy positions, casualty status, and extraction options. Morrison found himself impressed by her military bearing and professional competence. This wasn't some scared medic who'd been thrown into a bad situation. This was a combat veteran who knew exactly what she was doing. As enemy fire intensified around their position, Martinez calmly unpacked her medical equipment and began preparing for casualties. She worked with the efficiency of someone who'd done this countless times before. setting up triage areas and organizing supplies with military precision. Morrison watched her work and found himself wondering about her background. Most medics he'd worked with were competent, but few displayed this level of tactical awareness and battlefield composure. The firefight that followed lasted for hours. Enemy forces repeatedly tried to overrun their position, and Morrison's team found themselves running low on ammunition and options. Through it all, Martinez moved fearlessly between positions, treating wounded SEALs and keeping them in the fight. She seemed to have an uncanny ability to anticipate where she'd be needed next, always appearing at exactly the right moment with exactly the right medical intervention. When Williams took shrapnel to his leg from a rocket-propelled grenade, Martinez was there within seconds, applying pressure bandages and administering pain medication while bullets whistled overhead. When Thompson suffered a concussion from an explosion, she quickly assessed his neurological status and determined he could continue operating his communications equipment. Her medical skills were clearly exceptional, but what impressed Morrison most was her tactical awareness and her ability to function effectively under intense combat pressure. As dawn approached and extraction helicopters finally arrived, Morrison realized he'd witnessed something extraordinary. This small, unassuming medic had not only saved multiple lives under fire, but had done so with a level of professionalism and competence that rivaled his own elite operators. He found himself wondering who exactly Doc Martinez was, and what kind of experiences had shaped her into the warrior he'd just witnessed in action. Back at the forward operating base, Morrison couldn't get the image of Doc Martinez out of his mind. She had disappeared as quickly as she'd arrived, leaving only her call sign and a stack of professional medical reports documenting the treatment she'd provided to his wounded team members. Every report was meticulous, detailed, and demonstrated a level of medical knowledge that went far beyond basic combat medicine. Rodriguez, who'd taken shrapnel to his shoulder during the firefight, was particularly vocal about Martinez's medical skills. He'd been treated by dozens of medics over his career, but he'd never experienced the kind of pain management and wound care she'd provided under fire. She'd somehow managed to completely stop his bleeding, stabilize his injury, and get him back into the fight, all while bullets were flying overhead. Thompson, still recovering from his concussion, kept talking about how Martinez had recognized the subtle signs of his brain injury before he'd even realized he was hurt. She'd performed a rapid neurological assessment that would have impressed doctors in a fully equipped hospital, let alone a medic working in a combat zone. Her ability to diagnose and treat complex medical conditions under extreme stress was clearly exceptional. Williams, the team's sniper, was equally impressed by Martinez's tactical awareness. He'd watched her move across the battlefield during the firefight, and she demonstrated an understanding of cover and concealment that many infantry soldiers never developed. She'd anticipated enemy movements, positioned herself to avoid crossfire, and somehow managed to reach wounded operators without exposing herself unnecessarily to hostile fire. Morrison decided to do some research into Doc Martinez's background. As a SEAL team leader, he had access to personnel databases that most people never saw. What he discovered when he looked up her service record left him speechless. Elena Martinez wasn't just any Navy medic. She was a recipient of the Navy Cross, the second highest military decoration for valor, awarded for extraordinary heroism in combat. The citation described actions during a previous deployment, where Martinez had single-handedly rescued an entire Marine squad that had been pinned down by enemy fire. According to the official report, she'd volunteered for a mission that 3 different male medics had refused to attempt. Under cover of darkness, she'd crawled through enemy lines, reached the wounded Marines, and provided medical treatment while coordinating their evacuation. The mission had saved 8 lives and resulted in the successful completion of a critical operation, but that wasn't all. Martinez's service record showed multiple combat deployments across Iraq and Afghanistan, each one documenting extraordinary acts of courage and medical excellence. She'd been attached to Ranger units, Marine Expeditionary Forces, and Special Operations Commands. Her performance evaluations read like something out of a military legend, with consistent ratings of exceptional performance under the most challenging conditions imaginable. Morrison discovered that Martinez had also earned a Bronze Star with V device for valor, a Purple Heart for wounds received in combat, and a combat medical badge with multiple additional awards. Her educational background was equally impressive. She held advanced certifications in trauma medicine, emergency surgery, and battlefield medicine that typically required years of specialized training. She'd attended courses at the Army's Special Operations Medical Training Facility and had completed advanced trauma programs usually reserved for military surgeons. What really caught Morrison's attention were the personal recommendations in her file from previous commanders. A Marine colonel described her as the finest combat medic I've encountered in 25 years of military service. An Army Ranger Battalion commander wrote that Doc Martinez possesses the rare combination of exceptional medical skills and uncommon courage that makes her invaluable in combat operations. Special Forces Group Commander noted that she has repeatedly volunteered for missions that other medical personnel considered too dangerous to attempt. Morrison also found records of Martinez's involvement in classified operations that he wasn't cleared to read in detail. The redacted mission summaries suggested she'd been involved in high-risk rescue operations, special reconnaissance missions, and direct action raids that typically only involved the most elite military units. Her security clearances were higher than most officers he knew, indicating she'd been trusted with some of the military's most sensitive operations. As he dug deeper into her background, Morrison learned that Martinez had actually turned down multiple opportunities for promotion and reassignment to safer positions. She'd repeatedly requested combat assignments and had specifically asked to remain attached to frontline units despite having accumulated enough service time and qualifications to move into administrative or training roles. This wasn't someone who'd stumbled into combat medicine by accident. This was someone who'd deliberately chosen the most dangerous and challenging assignments the military had to offer. Morrison's research also revealed that Martinez had saved the lives of over 60 service members during her various deployments. Her casualty survival rates were statistically impossible according to normal medical standards, yet they were thoroughly documented in official reports. She'd performed emergency surgeries in the field, conducted medical evacuations under fire, and treated wounds that other medics considered fatal. Her success rate in treating traumatic injuries exceeded that of many hospital emergency rooms operating under ideal conditions. The more Morrison learned about Martinez, the more he realized that his team had been rescued by someone who was essentially a legend in the special operations community. She wasn't just a competent medic who'd happened to be in the right place at the right time. She was one of the most decorated and experienced combat medics in the entire U.S. military, someone whose reputation for courage and medical excellence was known throughout the special operations community. Morrison began asking around among other SEAL teams and special operations units, trying to learn more about Martinez's reputation. The stories he heard were almost unbelievable. Multiple operators told him about missions where Martinez had saved their lives or the lives of their teammates. Some described medical treatments she'd performed that seemed impossible under combat conditions. Others talked about her uncanny ability to appear exactly where she was needed most, often seeming to anticipate casualties before they occurred. One SEAL Chief Petty Officer told Morrison about a mission in Iraq where Martinez had treated a teammate who'd stepped on an improvised explosive device. The blast had caused massive trauma that should have been fatal, but Martinez had somehow stabilized the injured operator and kept him alive during a 6-hour evacuation through hostile territory. The wounded SEAL not only survived but eventually returned to full duty, something doctors had said was impossible given the extent of his injuries. Morrison realized that his team hadn't just been lucky to have Doc Martinez respond to their emergency. They'd been rescued by someone whose skills and courage were so exceptional that she'd become something of a legend among the special operations community. The calm professional medic who'd saved his team's lives was actually one of the most highly decorated combat veterans in the entire military, someone whose service record read like a collection of impossible heroic acts that had somehow all been verified and documented. Word of Morrison's research began spreading through the SEAL team stationed at the base. What started as casual conversation about the exceptional medic who'd saved their lives had evolved into something approaching disbelief as more details of Martinez's service record emerged. SEALs were accustomed to working with elite personnel, but Martinez's combination of medical expertise and combat experience was unprecedented in their collective experience. Chief Petty Officer Marcus Sullivan, a veteran SEAL with over 15 years of service, initially dismissed the stories as exaggerated. Sullivan had worked with dozens of medics during his career, and while many were competent and brave, he'd never encountered anyone who lived up to the kind of reputation Morrison was describing. But as more SEALs came forward with their own stories about Martinez, Sullivan began to realize that something extraordinary was happening. The turning point came when Sullivan contacted a former teammate who'd transferred to a Marine Special Operations Unit 2 years earlier. Staff Sergeant Mike Chen had served with Martinez during a particularly brutal deployment in Afghanistan's Helmand province, and his account of her service left Sullivan speechless. Chen described a 6-month deployment where Martinez had been attached to his unit during some of the heaviest fighting of the war. According to Chen, Martinez had volunteered for every dangerous mission his unit had conducted. She'd repeatedly inserted herself into situations that other medical personnel had deemed too risky to attempt. During one mission, she'd crawled across open ground under sniper fire to reach wounded Marines, performing emergency surgery while bullets impacted the ground around her. Her medical interventions had saved multiple lives that day, but what impressed Chen most was her absolute refusal to abandon wounded personnel regardless of the tactical situation. Chen told Sullivan about another incident where Martinez had remained with a critically wounded Marine for over 8 hours while their position was surrounded by enemy forces. She'd performed continuous medical care throughout the night, using improvised equipment and limited supplies to keep the wounded Marine alive. When extraction finally arrived, the Marine had been stabilized enough to survive a helicopter flight to a field hospital, something that military doctors later said should have been impossible given his injuries and the circumstances. But Chen's most remarkable story involved a mission where Martinez had single-handedly treated casualties from an entire platoon that had been caught in a complex ambush. Working alone and under intense enemy fire, she'd triaged nearly 20 wounded Marines, performing emergency procedures that ranged from simple wound care to complex surgical interventions. Her ability to prioritize casualties and allocate limited medical resources had resulted in a survival rate that exceeded anything the military had previously documented under similar circumstances. Sullivan began reaching out to other units that had worked with Martinez, and the stories that emerged painted a picture of someone whose capabilities seemed to transcend normal human limitations. A Ranger Battalion commander described her as the most tactically proficient medic he'd ever encountered. A Special Forces Group Sergeant Major said she'd demonstrated medical skills that he'd only seen from experienced military surgeons. A Marine Expeditionary Unit commander wrote that she'd redefined what was possible in battlefield medicine. The more Sullivan investigated, the more he realized that Martinez's reputation extended throughout the entire Special Operations community. She'd become something of a legend among units that routinely worked in the most dangerous environments the military had to offer. Operators who'd served with her spoke of her with a reverence typically reserved for the most elite warriors. Yet she was officially classified as a support personnel rather than a combat operator. Sullivan discovered that Martinez had actually been offered multiple opportunities to transfer into direct combat roles. Several special operations units had attempted to recruit her as an operator rather than a medic, recognizing that her tactical skills and combat experience rivaled those of their best personnel. She'd consistently turned down these offers, stating that her mission was to save lives rather than take them. But her refusal to leave medical service hadn't diminished her reputation among combat units. What particularly impressed the SEALs was learning about Martinez's involvement in classified rescue operations. While the specific details remained classified, Sullivan was able to confirm that she'd participated in multiple hostage rescue missions and prisoner recovery operations. These missions typically involved the most elite special operations units and were considered among the most dangerous and complex operations the military conducted. The fact that a medic had been deemed essential personnel for such missions spoke volumes about her capabilities. Sullivan also learned that Martinez had developed innovative medical techniques that had been adopted throughout the military medical community. She'd created new protocols for treating traumatic brain injuries in combat situations, developed improved methods for controlling hemorrhaging under fire, and pioneered techniques for performing emergency surgery with minimal equipment. Her contributions to military medicine had saved countless lives beyond those she'd personally treated in combat. The more the SEALs learned about Martinez, The more they began to understand that their rescue hadn't been a routine medical evacuation, they'd been saved by someone whose skills and experience were so exceptional that she'd become a legend within the special operations community. Her calm professionalism during their firefight hadn't been the result of basic training and experience. It had been the product of years of the most intensive combat experience imaginable. Combined with medical training that exceeded that of most military surgeons, Rodriguez, still recovering from his shoulder wound, began asking other medical personnel at the base about Martinez's reputation. The responses he received were unanimous. Every medic, nurse, and doctor who'd worked with her described her skills as extraordinary. A Navy surgeon told him that Martinez's field medical reports were so detailed and accurate that they could be used as textbook examples of battlefield medicine. An Army physician assistant said she'd learned more about trauma medicine from working with Martinez for a week than she'd learned in months of formal training. Williams, the team sniper, began researching Martinez's tactical training background. What he discovered was that she'd attended many of the same advanced courses as special operations personnel. She'd completed urban warfare training, advanced marksmanship courses, and tactical leadership programs typically reserved for combat units. Her training records showed consistent superior performance in all areas, including physical fitness standards that exceeded those required for most combat positions. Thompson, the communications specialist, used his technical skills to dig deeper into Martinez's operational history. The classified mission summaries he was able to access, even in redacted form, painted a picture of someone who'd been involved in some of the military's most sensitive and dangerous operations. Her security clearances and operational experience suggested she'd been trusted with missions that only the most elite and reliable personnel were allowed to participate in. As the full scope of Martinez's service record became clear to Morrison's SEAL team, they began to realize that they'd been rescued by someone whose capabilities and experience exceeded those of many special operations personnel. The unassuming medic who'd saved their lives was actually one of the most decorated and experienced combat veterans in the entire military, someone whose legend had been growing throughout the special operations community for years. The revelation of Martinez's true capabilities had spread beyond Morrison's SEAL team to encompass the entire special operations community at the forward operating base. What had begun as curiosity about an exceptional medic had evolved into something approaching awe as more details of her service record emerged. Veterans who had served in the most elite units were describing her with a reverence typically reserved for the most legendary warriors in military history. Master Chief Petty Officer David Harrison, the senior enlisted SEAL at the base, decided to investigate Martinez's background personally. Harrison had 22 years of special operations experience and had worked with some of the most elite personnel the military had produced. His standards for exceptional performance were extraordinarily high, shaped by years of serving alongside the most capable warriors in the world. The stories he was hearing about Martinez seemed almost too extraordinary to believe. Harrison's investigation revealed details that even Morrison's research had missed. Martinez had not only served with elite units, but had actually been specifically requested by name for some of the military's most challenging missions. Her personnel file contained letters of recommendation from generals, admirals, and special operations commanders who typically didn't involve themselves in the careers of enlisted medical personnel. These weren't routine commendations, but personal endorsements that described her as irreplaceable and essential to mission success. One letter, written by a Marine Corps general who commanded Special Operations Forces in Afghanistan, described a mission where Martinez had been the determining factor in a successful rescue operation. According to the general's account, she'd volunteered to accompany a direct action raid on a compound where American hostages were being held. During the assault, multiple operators had been wounded by improvised explosive devices, creating a medical emergency that threatened the entire mission. Martinez had treated casualties while the firefight continued around her, stabilizing wounded operators and enabling them to continue fighting. Her medical interventions had allowed the rescue team to complete their mission and successfully extract the hostages. Harrison discovered that Martinez had actually been awarded classified decorations for missions that couldn't be publicly acknowledged. These awards, which weren't reflected in her standard service record, recognized her participation in operations that remained classified years after their completion. The existence of these hidden honors suggested that her most significant contributions to military operations couldn't be fully documented in official records due to their sensitive nature. The Master Chief also learned that Martinez had been personally selected by special operations commanders for missions where medical support was considered critical to success. These weren't routine assignments, but specific requests for her services based on her unique combination of medical expertise and combat experience. Unit commanders who typically had access to any personnel they requested had specifically asked for Martinez by name, considering her essential to their most important operations. Harrison's research revealed that Martinez had developed a reputation for accepting missions that other medical personnel had declined. She'd repeatedly volunteered for assignments that were considered too dangerous for standard medical support, inserting herself into situations where the risk of casualties among support personnel was deemed unacceptable. Her willingness to accept these high-risk assignments had made her invaluable to special operations units that required medical support for their most dangerous missions. What particularly impressed Harrison was learning about Martinez's role in developing new tactics and procedures for combat medicine. She'd worked with special operations units to create new methods for providing medical support during high-risk operations. Her innovations had been adopted throughout the special operations community and had significantly improved casualty survival rates during the most dangerous types of missions. Her contributions to tactical medicine had influenced how the entire military approached medical support in combat situations. Harrison also discovered that Martinez had served as an instructor at several advanced military medical training facilities. She'd taught courses on battlefield medicine to personnel from all branches of the military, sharing techniques and procedures that she'd developed during her own combat experience. Her teaching had influenced hundreds of military medical personnel, spreading her innovations throughout the military medical community and saving lives on battlefields around the world. The Master Chief learned that Martinez had actually been offered positions as a senior enlisted advisor at major military medical commands, but she'd consistently declined these opportunities in favor of remaining in combat assignments. Her decision to stay in field positions rather than accept prestigious administrative roles demonstrated a commitment to frontline service that was rare even among the most dedicated military personnel. Harrison's investigation also revealed that Martinez had been involved in humanitarian missions that had saved civilian lives in addition to her military service. She'd volunteered for disaster relief operations, medical missions in developing countries, and emergency response situations that had allowed her to use her skills to help civilian populations. These missions had been conducted during her leave time and at her own expense, demonstrating a dedication to helping others that extended beyond her military obligations. As Harrison shared his findings with other senior personnel at the base, the impact on the special operations community was profound. These were warriors who had served alongside Medal of Honor recipients, legendary operators whose names were spoken with reverence throughout the military. Yet the consensus among these experienced professionals was that Martinez's service record was unlike anything they'd encountered in their collective decades of military experience. The reaction among the SEAL teams was particularly significant. SEALs prided themselves on being the most elite naval special operations force, and they typically viewed support personnel, regardless of their competence, as exactly that, support rather than peers. But Martinez's service record and combat experience had earned her something that was almost unprecedented: the respect and admiration of the SEAL community as an equal rather than a support. Asset Chief Warrant Officer James Mitchell, a SEAL with extensive experience in personnel evaluation, told Harrison that Martinez's service record read like a combination of the best aspects of multiple legendary military careers. Her medical achievements paralleled those of the most famous military surgeons, while her combat experience rivaled that of the most decorated infantry personnel. Her leadership and tactical skills were comparable to those of successful special operations officers. Yet she'd accomplished all of this while maintaining her primary focus on saving lives rather than taking them. The more the special operations community learned about Martinez, the more they began to understand that their previous assumptions about support personnel had been fundamentally challenged. Martinez had demonstrated that the traditional distinctions between combat and support roles were inadequate to describe someone whose capabilities transcended normal military classifications. She was simultaneously a medical professional, a combat veteran, a tactical expert, and a leader whose influence extended throughout the military community. Morrison found himself wondering how someone with Martinez's capabilities and experience had remained relatively unknown outside the special operations community. Her service record suggested she deserved recognition at the highest levels of the military. Yet she'd apparently chosen to remain in field positions where her contributions were known only to the units she'd served with directly. Her decision to prioritize service over recognition had created a situation where one of the military's most exceptional performers was known primarily through word of mouth among the people whose lives she'd saved. The impact of learning about Martinez's true background had created an atmosphere of anticipation among the SEALs at the forward operating base. Word had spread that she was scheduled to return to their location for a routine medical consultation with Rodriguez, whose shoulder wound required follow-up treatment. What had originally been planned as a simple medical appointment had evolved into something approaching a formal reception as the entire special operations community prepared to properly acknowledge someone they now recognized as a legend. Morrison found himself experiencing emotions he'd never felt. About a support personnel visit, the SEALs who'd been saved by Martinez during the firefight had shared their story with everyone at the base. But the subsequent research into her background had transformed their gratitude into something approaching reverence. These were operators who'd served alongside some of the most elite personnel in the military, yet none of them had encountered anyone whose service record approached Martinez's combination of medical excellence and combat achievement. Chief Petty Officer Sullivan had taken it upon himself to organize an informal gathering of senior personnel who wanted to meet Martinez personally. Word of her pending arrival had spread throughout the special operations community at the base, and operators from multiple units had requested the opportunity to meet someone whose reputation had reached legendary status within their community. Sullivan had never seen such interest in a single individual's visit, particularly someone who was officially classified as support personnel rather than a combat operator. The morning of Martinez's scheduled arrival, Morrison noticed an unusual level of activity around the base. Personnel who typically focused exclusively on their own missions were asking about her expected arrival time. Operators who rarely showed interest in medical personnel were discussing her service record and asking about opportunities to meet her. The atmosphere was reminiscent of preparations for a visit from a high-ranking officer or a celebrity, yet Martinez held a relatively modest rank and position within the military hierarchy. Rodriguez, whose medical appointment was the official reason for Martinez's visit, had become something of a celebrity himself among the base personnel. Everyone wanted to hear first-hand accounts of her medical treatment during the firefight, and Rodriguez found himself repeatedly describing her calm professionalism and exceptional medical skills. His descriptions of her tactical awareness and combat competence had only added to the growing legend surrounding her capabilities. Williams, the team sniper, had been particularly vocal about Martinez's tactical skills. He'd observed her movement patterns during the firefight and had been impressed by her ability to navigate the battlefield while avoiding enemy fire. Her understanding of cover and concealment, combined with her ability to anticipate enemy movements, had demonstrated a level of tactical competence that Williams typically only saw among experienced infantry personnel. Her ability to function effectively in a combat environment while maintaining focus on her medical responsibilities had impressed him more than anything he'd witnessed in his military career. Thompson, still dealing with lingering effects from his concussion, had become an advocate for Martinez's diagnostic abilities. He'd researched her medical training and had learned that she'd completed advanced courses in neurological assessment that most military medics never had access to. Her ability to recognize and treat his brain injury under combat conditions had potentially prevented long-term damage that could have ended his military career. His recovery had exceeded medical expectations, something he attributed directly to Martinez's immediate and expert intervention. As the time for Martinez's arrival approached, Morrison realized that something unprecedented was happening at their forward operating base. The entire special operations community was preparing to meet someone they'd come to regard as a peer, rather than support personnel. The traditional military hierarchy that typically governed interactions between combat, operators, and medical personnel had been fundamentally altered by the revelation of Martinez's extraordinary service, record, and combat experience. Master Chief Harrison had decided to attend the informal gathering, something he rarely did for visits by support personnel. Harrison's presence would send a clear message about how the senior enlisted leadership viewed Martinez's status within the special operations community. His attendance would also provide an opportunity for the most experienced SEAL at the base to personally assess someone whose reputation had reached almost mythical proportions among his personnel. The helicopter carrying Martinez arrived exactly on schedule, touching down in a cloud of dust and rotor wash that was typical of aircraft operations at the forward base. Morrison watched through binoculars as a single figure disembarked, carrying the same massive medical kit he remembered from their rescue mission. From a distance, Martinez appeared unremarkable, a small, professional-looking medical officer going about routine duties. Nothing in her appearance suggested the legendary status she'd achieved within the special operations community. As Martinez made her way toward the medical facility where her appointment with Rodriguez was scheduled, Morrison noticed something he hadn't observed during their previous encounter. Other personnel at the base were watching her arrival with obvious interest. Conversations stopped as she passed, and operators who typically showed little interest in medical personnel were clearly paying attention to her presence. The level of interest her arrival had generated was unlike anything Morrison had witnessed during his military career. Martinez appeared oblivious to the attention her presence was generating. She moved with the same calm professionalism Morrison remembered from the firefight, focused on her mission, and apparently unaware that her reputation had preceded her arrival. Her demeanor suggested someone who was accustomed to being treated as routine support personnel rather than as the legendary figure she'd become within the special operations community. Rodriguez met Martinez at the medical facility, and Morrison could see them engaged in what appeared to be a routine medical consultation. Martinez's examination of Rodriguez's wound was thorough and professional, demonstrating the same attention to detail Morrison had observed during the firefight. Her medical competence was obvious even to observers who lacked medical training, yet she conducted herself with the modest professionalism typical of support personnel, rather than the confidence typically displayed by personnel aware of their legendary statuses. Word spread that Martinez had arrived and was conducting her medical consultation. Personnel throughout the base began finding reasons to visit the medical facility. The area around the building became increasingly crowded as operators from multiple units positioned themselves to catch glimpses of someone whose reputation had reached legendary proportions. Within their community, the level of interest her presence had generated was unprecedented in Morrison's experience. Morrison found himself wondering how Martinez would react when she realized the extent to which her reputation had spread throughout the special operations community. The woman who'd saved his team's lives during a desperate firefight had no apparent awareness that her service record had made her a legend among some of the military's most elite personnel. Her modest demeanor and professional focus suggested someone who viewed herself as simply doing her job rather than as someone whose capabilities had redefined what was possible in military medicine. The stage was set for what Morrison anticipated would be an extraordinary encounter. The entire special operations community at the forward base was preparing to acknowledge someone they'd come to regard as one of the most exceptional personnel they'd ever encountered. Yet Martinez appeared to have no awareness of the status she'd achieved. The contrast between her reputation and her modest demeanor had created a situation that Morrison suspected would be unlike anything he'd witnessed in his military career. The moment Morrison had been anticipating arrived when Rodriguez's medical consultation concluded and Martinez emerged from the medical facility. Chief Petty Officer Sullivan approached her with the kind of formal bearing typically reserved for interactions with senior officers, despite the fact that Martinez held a lower rank than most of the SEALs gathered to meet her. Sullivan's demeanor immediately signaled to Martinez that something unusual was happening. Though she appeared puzzled by the level of attention her presence was generating, Sullivan introduced himself and explained that several personnel wanted to meet her personally to express their appreciation for her service to the special operations community. Martinez's reaction was one of genuine surprise and apparent confusion. She seemed genuinely unaware that her reputation had spread beyond the units she'd served with directly, and the level of interest in meeting her was clearly unexpected. Her modest response suggested someone who was uncomfortable with recognition and preferred to focus on her professional responsibilities rather than personal acknowledgement. Morrison stepped forward to introduce himself as the SEAL team leader whose unit Martinez had rescued during the recent firefight. As he began to thank her for her service, Martinez's demeanor remained professional but modest, deflecting credit and emphasizing that she'd simply been doing her job. Her response was typical of military personnel who were uncomfortable with recognition, yet Morrison could see that she was beginning to realize that the SEAL's interest in meeting her went beyond routine appreciation for medical support. Master, Chief Harrison's arrival created a moment of obvious significance. Harrison's presence immediately elevated the formality of the gathering, and Martinez's recognition of his senior status was evident in her bearing. Harrison's introduction of himself and his expression of personal appreciation for her service to the special operations community clearly surprised Martinez, who seemed unprepared for recognition from such a senior enlisted leader. Her responses remained professional and modest, but Morrison could see that she was beginning to understand that her reputation extended far beyond what she'd realized. As more SEALs joined the informal gathering, each sharing their own appreciation for her service, Martinez's surprise became increasingly evident. Personnel were describing specific missions and operations where her medical interventions had saved lives, referencing details of her service record that she hadn't expected them to know. The breadth and depth of knowledge about her background clearly surprised her, suggesting that she'd had no idea her reputation had spread throughout the special operations community to the extent it had. Williams, the team sniper, approached Martinez to specifically thank her for her tactical competence during the firefight. His description of her movement patterns and battlefield awareness clearly surprised her, as most medical personnel weren't typically evaluated on their tactical skills by combat operators. Williams's assessment of her as tactically proficient enough to serve as a combat operator, rather than just medical support, was obviously unexpected, and Martinez seemed genuinely puzzled by the level of tactical respect she was receiving from elite personnel. Thompson's approach to thank Martinez for her neurological assessment and treatment provided another moment of obvious surprise. His description of her diagnostic capabilities and his explanation of how her medical intervention had potentially saved his career clearly moved her, but Morrison could see that she remained uncomfortable with the level of personal appreciation being expressed. Her consistent deflection of credit and emphasis on simply doing her job suggested someone who genuinely didn't view her exceptional performance as anything beyond normal professional responsibility. Rodriguez's public description of Martinez's medical treatment during the firefight provided the gathering with first-hand accounts of her exceptional capabilities under fire. His detailed description of her pain management techniques, wound care procedures, and ability to continue providing medical support while under enemy fire clearly impressed the assembled SEALs, many of whom had extensive experience with combat medicine. Rodriguez's account of her medical competence and tactical awareness provided concrete examples of the capabilities that had made her legendary within the special operations community. As the informal gathering continued, Morrison noticed that Martinez was beginning to understand the full scope of how her reputation had spread throughout the base. Personnel were sharing stories about her service that she hadn't expected them to know, referencing missions and operations from throughout her career. The realization that her background had been researched and discussed extensively throughout the special operations community was clearly surprising to someone who'd apparently expected to remain anonymous outside the units she'd served with directly. Chief Warrant Officer Mitchell approached Martinez with a formal expression of appreciation from the SEAL community, describing her as someone whose service record represented the best traditions of military excellence. Mitchell's description of her as an example of what military service should aspire to clearly moved Martinez, though she continued to deflect personal credit. Mitchell's formal acknowledgement of her status within the special operations community seemed to help Martinez understand that the appreciation being expressed went beyond routine gratitude for medical support. The gathering reached its climax when Master Chief Harrison requested permission to read aloud from Martinez's official service record. Martinez's surprise at this request was obvious, and she seemed genuinely uncomfortable with having her achievements publicly acknowledged. Harrison's reading of her decorations, commendations, and mission summaries created a moment of absolute silence among the assembled SEALs as the full scope of her service was presented in an official format. The Navy Cross citation that Harrison read described actions that left the assembled SEALs speechless. The official language describing Martinez's rescue of an entire Marine squad under fire painted a picture of heroism that exceeded anything most of the SEALs had witnessed in their own careers. The detailed description of her actions, including crawling through enemy lines and providing medical treatment while coordinating evacuation under fire, created a moment of absolute reverence among personnel who were themselves recipients of significant military decorations. Harrison's reading of Martinez's Bronze Star citation provided another moment of stunned silence. The official description of her medical treatment of 20 wounded Marines while under sustained enemy fire demonstrated a level of capability and courage that challenged the assembled SEALs' understanding of what was possible in military medicine. The citation's description of her survival rates and medical achievements under impossible circumstances left experienced operators struggling to comprehend how such performance was possible. The Purple Heart citation that Harrison read created perhaps the most powerful moment of the gathering. The official description of Martinez's own wounds, received while treating casualties under fire, and her refusal to accept medical evacuation until all wounded personnel had been treated, demonstrated a level of dedication that exceeded anything the SEALs had encountered. The citation's description of her continuing to provide medical treatment while wounded herself created a moment of absolute silence among personnel who thought they understood the limits of professional dedication. As Harrison concluded his reading of Martinez's official record, the assembled SEALs remained speechless. Every person present had extensive military experience and had served alongside highly decorated personnel. Yet none had encountered a service record that approached the scope and significance of Martinez's achievements. The realization that they were in the presence of someone whose service exceeded their collective understanding of military excellence had created a moment unlike anything Morrison had experienced in his career. The silence that followed Master Chief Harrison's reading of Martinez's service record was unlike anything Morrison had experienced in his military career. The assembled SEALs, men who had faced the most dangerous situations imaginable and emerged victorious, stood speechless in the presence of someone whose achievements transcended their collective understanding of military excellence. The official citations that Harrison had read aloud painted a picture of service that seemed almost mythical in scope. Yet every word had been verified and documented by the military's most stringent standards. Martinez herself appeared overwhelmed by the public acknowledgement of her service record. Her modest demeanor and obvious discomfort with recognition suggested someone who had never expected her achievements to be publicly acknowledged in such a formal manner. The realization that her service had been researched, discussed, and admired by some of the military's most elite personnel was clearly surprising to someone who had apparently viewed her exceptional performance as simply fulfilling her professional responsibilities. Morrison watched as individual SEALs began approaching Martinez with expressions of personal appreciation that went far beyond routine military courtesy. These were operators who typically reserved their highest respect for fellow combat personnel, yet they were treating Martinez with a reverence typically accorded only to the most legendary military figures. The traditional barriers between combat and support personnel had been completely eliminated by the revelation of her extraordinary service record and achievements. Rodriguez stepped forward to publicly thank Martinez not just for her medical treatment but for demonstrating what true military excellence looked like. His words carried particular weight because he had experienced her capabilities firsthand during the firefight, and his description of her performance under fire provided concrete validation of the achievements described in her official record. Rodriguez's public acknowledgement of Martinez as someone who had redefined his understanding of military capability clearly moved both Martinez and the assembled personnel. Williams. The team sniper approached Martinez with an admission that surprised everyone present. He publicly acknowledged that Martinez's tactical competence and battlefield awareness exceeded that of many combat operators he'd served with, and he expressed genuine respect for someone whose capabilities transcended traditional military classifications. Williams's assessment carried particular weight because his standards for tactical competence were extraordinarily high, shaped by years of service with elite units where technical proficiency could mean the difference between mission success and failure. Thompson's approach to thank Martinez created another powerful moment in the gathering. His description of her neurological assessment and treatment demonstrated medical capabilities that exceeded those of most military physicians. Yet she had performed these procedures under combat conditions that would have challenged the most experienced medical professionals. Thompson's public acknowledgement of Martinez as someone who had potentially saved his career and long-term health provided concrete evidence of the life-changing impact of her medical expertise. Chief Petty Officer Sullivan stepped forward to make a formal statement on behalf of the SEAL community at the forward operating base. His declaration that Martinez represented the highest traditions of military service and had earned the respect and admiration of the entire Special Operations community created a moment of obvious emotion among the assembled personnel. Sullivan's formal recognition of Martinez as someone whose service transcended normal military classifications provided official acknowledgement of her extraordinary status within the Special Operations community. Master Chief Harrison concluded the gathering with a personal statement that surprised everyone present, including Martinez herself. Harrison publicly declared that Martinez's service record represented the finest example of military excellence he had encountered in over 2 decades of Special Operations service. His admission that her achievements had challenged his understanding of what was possible in military service provided the highest possible endorsement from someone whose standards for excellence were legendary within the SEAL community. As the formal gathering concluded, individual SEALs continued to approach Martinez with personal expressions of appreciation and respect. Morrison observed conversations where experienced operators were seeking her professional advice, asking about her tactical insights, and requesting guidance on medical procedures. The dynamic had completely shifted from routine appreciation for support services to genuine consultation with someone recognized as a peer and expert within the Special Operations community. Martinez's responses to the individual approaches remained modest and professional, but Morrison could see that she was beginning to accept the reality of her reputation within the Special Operations community. Her surprise at being treated as an equal by elite personnel was gradually being replaced by an understanding that her service had earned genuine recognition from some of the military's most demanding professionals. The transition from viewing herself as support personnel to accepting recognition as an exceptional military professional was clearly challenging for someone who had always focused on service rather than personal recognition. The impact of the gathering extended beyond the immediate participants to influence the entire forward operating base. Word of Martinez's service record and the SEAL's public recognition of her achievements spread throughout the base personnel, creating a new understanding of what was possible in military service. The revelation that someone classified as support personnel had achieved a level of excellence that exceeded that of most combat operators challenged traditional assumptions about military roles and capabilities. Morrison found himself reflecting on how the encounter had changed his own understanding of military excellence. The discovery of Martinez's true capabilities had demonstrated that exceptional service could transcend traditional military classifications and that the most extraordinary achievements sometimes came from personnel who worked outside the spotlight of public recognition. Martinez's combination of medical expertise, tactical competence, and battlefield courage had created a new standard for what constituted exceptional military service. As Martinez prepared to depart the forward operating base, the atmosphere had been permanently changed by the revelation of her extraordinary service record. The SEALs who had been saved by her medical intervention during the firefight now understood that they had been rescued by someone whose capabilities and achievements placed her among the most exceptional military personnel of their generation. The modest medic who had responded to their emergency call had revealed herself To be a legend whose service had redefined what was possible in military medicine and combat support. The silence that had followed the reading of Martinez's service record had evolved into a new understanding of military excellence that would influence how the special operations community viewed support personnel for years to come. Martinez's achievements had demonstrated that the most extraordinary military service sometimes came from personnel who chose to save lives rather than take them, and that true heroism could be found in the selfless dedication to helping others regardless of personal risk or recognition. Morrison realized that his team's rescue had been more than a successful medical evacuation. They had encountered someone whose service represented the very best of military tradition, someone whose achievements would be remembered and discussed within the special operations community long after her active service had concluded. The wounded and wordless moment when every SEAL fell silent had marked not just recognition of exceptional service, but acknowledgement of a legend whose story would inspire military professionals for generations to come.